So, welcome back, everybody. This is Night Flight, and today I have Frank Jacob with me, and his website is frankjacob.com. He is an independent filmmaker, and among his films are productions like Packing for Mars, Solar Revolution, and the one that we are going to talk about today, that is Project Looking Glass, just to name a few. So, Frank, welcome to the show, and please tell us a little bit, how did that happen? Did you always wanted to go into the field of movies, films, documentaries?
Yes, well, thanks for having me on, Judith. I um, I did always kind of want to get into media of some kind. I mean, at least, from an early enough point in my life where I recognized the power of media and the power of storytelling. But I took a winding road to get there, and I started in the field of music. I was inspired early on in my life by and I had an older friend who was reading the works of Carlos Castaneda and sort of those kind of materials, and we used to work out together, and we would talk about this stuff. And for me, it was very fascinating, and it kind of lured me into the world of metaphysics. So I knew that that kind of impressed itself on my mind very early in my life. I think, was I there 14, 13, 14 years old. And then it just kind of evolved from there. I got into music, and music, I thought was a great vehicle to kind of express ideas and lyrics and messages, and a great way to kind of undermine the consciousness of people. If you get them kind of repeating, the same refrain, chorus, and you slide in some interesting, subtle metaphysical messages into that, you could actually change reality. That was kind of my fantasy. But as it is, everybody who, out of the people who try to make it in the music business, it's not so cut and dry. It doesn't matter if you're talented or if you're really good or if your band is great or if your voice is good, or it doesn't really, none of that really matters. So, I learned that eventually. And in the meantime, I kind of picked up skills. Like, I didn't want to wait for a record deal, so I learned how to go into a studio and learn to tweak the little knobs and record music. And I got familiar with processing of sound and signal flow and all that stuff. And eventually that audio world migrated into the digital world. And once that happened, that opened up the idea of, yeah, higher quality audio recordings, but eventually also video. And because I was in high school, somebody who was interested in film, I took a course in film. I even won an award for a film I produced when I was in 12th grade, I think. And so I always kind of saw audio at that point as a vehicle to mix with visuals, and I saw it as a multimedia destiny. But that took a while as well. So I went from audio to eventually to video, and then eventually into actually producing and cutting films and all kinds of formats, short, long, and yeah, so that's kind of how it evolved. And eventually, I brought that metaphysical stuff back into the world of filmmaking and of expression in the audiovisual medium.
Hmm. When you look back at your films, do you have a favorite one, or is that like asking who's your favorite child?
Well, this one here that you kind of see over my shoulder that you mentioned is called Packing from Mars. That one, I guess I would be close to saying it would be my favorite because it was the first time that I brought my production skills to another level altogether. And it was kind of like my master's thesis, if you will. I never went to university or studied anything. I'm all autodidactisch, as they call it in German, self-taught, self-educated. So in that project, I took my skills as somebody who could point to camera to somebody who could edit and add music and tell stories and be in it and everything, cinematography, and kind of made it my master's project. But I wanted to take a crazy subject. I didn't just want to make a documentary about a bunch of talking heads that are talking about environmental issues or whatever most documentaries are about. I wanted to kind of go off the crazy path. And I was looking for a story, and I eventually found a story that was based on a book somebody had given to me along one of the chapters of my life called Alternative 3, which was a story about an off-world colony that had set up on Mars. And that kind of became sort of the journey that brought me out of where I was in terms of just living side by side with all the normal people, and getting back into like exploring. Let's see, is this really a true story, or is the author was of that book Alternative 3 wrote it as fiction, and here I'd found people in the world claiming to be whistleblowers connected to Mars and connected to off-world colonies, and so I began that journey. And I guess you could say that that film is sort of the entry point that took me down the rabbit hole once and for all, and I've never returned or recovered ever since.
Yeah, okay. And Project Looking Glass, what prompted that production?
Well, Project Looking Glass was something that I'd heard about while I was making Packing for Mars because I ended up interviewing two people that were closely connected with the people who were bringing that story out. For example, a guy called Dan Burish. And those people had set up something called Project Camelot. It was a guy called Bill Ryan and a woman called Carrie Cassidy. And they were kind of like on my go-to list for, hey, if I'm going to make a film and I want to talk to people who have talked to the craziest people, they're the ones I need to go for. And so Bill Ryan and I kind of really connected in that shoot, that interview I did of them. And after I left and went on the rest of the journey for filming, during that trip, he called me and said, hey, we should get together later. I have another project I'd like to introduce you to. And he knew about Project Looking Glass. And so and also my production partner, Tonya Maidenford, she knew about Project Looking Glass from some of her contacts. But I didn't see it fitting into the Mars thing so much. So I took it in, I stashed it in my archive, and I didn't really do much with it. And then about, let's see, the whole Project Looking Glass thing came to a climax in 2012, and where things were supposed to happen. And we all know 2012 was one of those mystery years where everyone expected the world to change. The people would wake up, the elites would disappear. We know that that's exactly what happened. So, no, I'm being sarcastic. I guess you get that. But what happened is that after 2012, nothing happened. And then 10 years later, we entered into this really weird chapter called COVID. And during the COVID times, I started to do research in other areas, and came across a journalist who was in the middle of the Ukraine at the time that all that was beginning, and I was studying kind of his Telegram channel, and all of a sudden I saw this thing called Guardians of the Looking Glass, and I was like, "Wow, it's Guardians of the Looking Glass? That doesn't make any sense here whatsoever." And so I decided, well, I'll click on it and see what it's all about. And what was it? Well, it was a YouTube channel that had just been set up days earlier, and it had two videos on it, and these videos were talking about these were explanatory videos that were claiming to be made by a group that was involved in Project Looking Glass, and they decided to come forward after all these years of silence with urgent messages that they could no longer keep secret. And I thought this is a great story. I immediately was waiting for all the usual suspects to jump on and cover the story, but nobody did. And I sent it to Bill and I sent it to a few other people. And I thought, well, one of the messages was, look, the best way for us to do something with respect to the information about what's coming is to spread these videos. And if you can help us spread the videos, then maybe we can get enough people to look at the story and to talk about what's going on. And alone that would create a ripple in the timeline that was intended to happen. Because if ever too many people knew what was coming, then if it happened, it would spoil the whole project. The whole idea was to keep it secret and to use Project Looking Glass as a technology to gain advantage over other people. And so I thought, well, why not? I'll just write a story about it. And,
Mhm.
what harm can there be in writing a story? And I figured we'll take the story and in maybe a little bit of a different direction, and we'll tie in. what our timelines, tie in more consciousness elements to it, focus less on the doom and gloom, and talk more about the human mind, the potential of timelines and other areas. And I did that. And then by fluke, an expat from Austria now living in the United States called John Nolan we went to the portal which had released that story in Germany, found that story, and decided to reach out to the publisher and ask if he could put him in touch with me, which he did. Right after that, we did an interview, and about a half a million people watched that interview, and then literally that thing exploded. So I was right in the middle of this Looking Glass part two story, and that's kind of how it came back into my life.
Mhm. So when we hear the term looking glass, is that some type of machine or is it an entire process that they term Project Looking Glass?
Well, before we jump in here into that, like I
Mhm.
kind of want to frame, like it's been now since I released that story, another 4 years or something. And I want to, explain it in a way that keeps continuity with what people already know about Looking Glass, but also maybe give you a better idea of where my research has gone since I produced, like I did a whole series on that Looking Glass story, which I called The Tale of Two Timelines.
Mhm.
And so what I want to talk about maybe is where that research after I produced Tale of Timelines kind of led. Because when I first presented the Looking Glass story, it was a story that was known about things like J-rods,
Mhm.
majestic, convergent timelines, the doctrine of convergent timelines, for example, these strange guardian updates, etc. But what changed is that I went much deeper into how reality and timelines may actually work. Because let's face it, this material that we learn about is very science fiction. I mean, come on, it's hard to prove this stuff is real. You've got these people that call themselves whistleblowers, but some of them are very dubious. Some of the information, turns out to be misinformation. So it's a minefield for discerning minds. And so the idea of competing timelines, I've learned since, really does still hold up. But now I think more in terms of momentum fields. Like, the real war isn't about a so-called device. We can get into that, what that device is and what it was said to look like. More, but what it is, it's more about human perception and participation. And the reason this J-Rod story, which we can also I'll go in a little bit more if you want, still matters is because it matches something else that's very, very ancient, which I stumbled upon in the last 4 years. And that has to do with Gnosticism and the Gnostics' warning about a non-human intelligence that, is cold, synthetic, authority-driven, and then when you bring in another element, which I've been getting into, plasma, you start seeing how, entities and, these ideas of J-rods or beings, physical beings, might not always be physical visitors, but they might actually be intelligences in the environment that have the ability to interact with minds, human minds. Like you could say, I don't know if you know what the word egregore means.
Mhm.
It's kind of a phantom thought pattern that's lodged in the ether around us. And I think that mechanism is much deeper than we've ever thought or that we even really talk about. I think really for me, that is kind of the frontier of what we need to understand to figure out how to navigate the craziness in the world around us right now. So the Looking Glass story, it was kind of iconic because it's about polarities, right? It's about two futures, two trajectories, and the sense that something is fighting over, which one is going to become dominant. And I think, like I said, that part still holds, but not as a Hollywood script, more like a real pattern in how human history moves itself. In this case, we're witnessing a real-time revelation, you could say, of two put these very potential trajectories. And one of those trajectories is bringing us into what some people call the technocratic dream, and the other is the full realization of what I've been calling organic intelligence, or I call it the OI in some of the other shows and things that I've talked about in the last years or two. Um, being kind of like what the this ties back into Gnosticism. The Gnostics talked about the organic light, and they talked about a connection to the earth, to embodiment, and they made a contrast to the idea of it's all about learning to understand what true embodiment is versus and the true human potential, which they called nous, which is a kind of a divine, seed that we've been given that has in us something that we can grow, something we can grow into and develop to its fullest potential. And then the idea that there's this outside element, this the element of a savior, of a redeemer, or in the modern sense, what we're seeing with technocracy is the idea that there is a better life outside of the human body, that the human body is itself a fallible, inferior mistake, right? And it's interesting how the technocracy and the transhumanist ideals actually are an extension or a modern manifestation of what the early church was trying to tell us about the human, about humanity. Humanities are sinners. We're all smudged with, we've got like all this basically negative karma. We're stuck here on this planet, and the idea is to wake up and get off this planet and to get out of, off out of your body, literally into some astral plane, some heaven or some whatever. There's lots of different religious ideologies. They all have different names for it, but ideologically, if you just take the Abrahamic religions as, Islam, Judea, and Christianity, those three all have a similar they all have the same origin, and they all have a similar idea of that we're better somewhere else. We need to, get off this planet. And most importantly, we have to outsource our redemption to a higher power. That we don't have what it takes, that humanity itself isn't good enough to actually figure it out all on our own. We need help from someplace else. And so that vein has developed into three trajectories. One of them is religions. The Abrahamics, for the most part, are the dominant religious ideology. Then you have the transhumanists, the test realists, as I call them, the ones that want to take us from carbon-based life into silicon-based life. And then you have the UFO scene, which is about ETs, and the ETs are here all around us, hundreds of them, and they need to intervene. They need to fix the problems for us because we can't fix it. So those are three very, very powerful themes that all tie into this looking glass story if you look at it that way.
Yeah. Yeah, the in general, the Savior program is very, very popular. Unfortunately, it is still very popular. It doesn't matter if it is, Archangel Michael or the alien savior or this or the political savior and whatever. But
Yes.
that savior program actually is one thing that keeps us as, yeah, mental infants.
That's a very good way to describe it. I like that. And I was really into the work, and I still am, and I'm a friend of his, and we keep in touch because I brought him into my last two series, and his name is John Lamb Lash, and he's, you could say, the most authoritative Gnostic scholar on the planet right now, because not only is he into Gnosticism, but he's a comparative mythologist. He's 80 years old. He's got 40-year track record of studying these things. He's extremely intelligent and still very, very like, cutting edge with his material. And most importantly, he took Gnosticism and explained it in a way that was freed it from all of these pseudo-Christian overlays that we mostly get, like Elaine Pagels and some of the more popular Gnostic scholars that are out there, came from a Abrahamic religious background, and they were looking for parallels to early Christianity and Gnosticism. So they tied those together. And so you have this form of, Gnosticism light or pop Gnosticism, which I like to call it, which is kind of which compromised and got into the Christianity angle, the Redeemer and all that stuff, and the Christ has a different meaning in that form of Gnosticism. But John Lash took it into the idea of, hey, let's look at the source of the Gnostics and the Gnosticism that we know of today is from a series of books called the Nag Hammadi Library, which was discovered in 1945. And in 1947, they figured out what it actually was. And so he says the same kind of thing. It's like once you get past, the idea of the Redeemer and the Savior, it's like, what are we? Like children? Like we are still in kindergarten. We need, Daddy's got to come and fix the problem because you didn't figure it out yourself. That mentality is an overlay that is laid on top of humanity for the better part of the last, you could say 4,000 years, but let's just say when Christianity became very solid, in the early second, third century, that's kind of so the last 1700 years kind of really imprinted that egregore, that concept on our minds, and that's really captured um, mankind into this paradigm, which is based on something which Lash figured out actually that this Abrahamic apparition, Melchizedek, which visited him and gave him, passed along, the authority and was the foundation for for Abraham to take, the whole thing to the distance that it's gone, was actually an archontic penetration and an infection. In our context, it was a malware which was implanted into the dopamine circuits of the human mind. And it's a very and actually it can be explained chemically and physically as well. It's not just woo-woo. It's not just, some channeled idea. It's actually explainable, which I thought was some of the, which is the direction I think we need to go now if we really want to understand our roots and where we came from. We have to begin to tie in like testable reality into like real science into it and not just be passing along stories that get passed along. And you know how it is if you tell a story in a group of 10 people that's 1 minute long and you watch, by the time that story gets back to the source, it's a completely different story. And so this is what I like about his work, and this inspired me to kind of continue along that way, which is yes, we need to begin to look at really all these remnants as myths around us, and we need to, you know, um, reassess them and see if they're really valuable for us at all. Because, you have to ask yourself, what value is it to think that there's going to be a redeemer to come here and save our planet and to save humanity? What is that really doing to humanity and so on a subconscious level? And I'm not talking about just believers in the Bible. I mean, there's plenty of atheists out there that have grown up in the Abrahamic framework, and even if they don't believe in a Christ or a Jesus or God or whatever, they're still implanted or impregnated with this idea that the world is hell, that it's all going to end sometime, and it's this is a program that's been implanted by the archons. And the archons are, interestingly, and this is where it comes back again to the looking glass, because when I was exploring the looking glass material, particularly that word I mentioned earlier, J-rods came up. And Dan Bursch was talking about something called a clean sphere, which was this environment which they put this captured alien into. And he began communicating with this alien and bringing these messages out about, the looking glass and about timelines and whatnot, right? So what's interesting is the description of this J-Rod and how he looked. Well, it's really uncanny because if you go 2,000 years back and you look at the Gnostic documents, they talk about this kind of um, premature fetus-like being, which came about when Sophia fell from Pleroma and collided into the Kenoma, into matter, and she created this kind of abhorrent, splattered, incomplete species. And in the way they describe it, it looks exactly as what we describe nowadays as the gray ETs, the gray aliens. So that story ties right back in again to the Looking Glass, and so here's another interesting parallel. I mentioned that the Nag Hammadi Library was found in 1945. What's interesting is that it was found, I don't know if it's to the day. John Lash and I have talked about this, especially since he had his birthday in December, his 80th birthday. I think it was December 3rd. And he was saying that the Nag Hammadi Library was basically found the same week that he was born. Okay, so and then he became this champion of the material in the Nag Hammadi library. But what happens is that you get this thing which I call the 1947 nexus. And it's a very interesting time because the 1944 7 nexus is 2 years, or let's say a year, 18 months after the discovery of the Nag Hammadi library, which then in 1947 was actually the first time they figured out what it really was, because it lay dormant in a drawer, in someone's desk drawer for a long time before it was suddenly figured out what this thing was. And the Nag Hammadi library was found, you could say, then in 1947. What else was found in 1947? Well, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1947. And so here we have an interesting thing that happened. Very, very powerful when you think about it. 1947 was the year that the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. What are the Dead Sea Scrolls? The Dead Sea Scrolls are the left remnants of the writings and documents that were discovered in the Dead Sea, as it's already called, by from a nomad or a group of a tribe of fanatical, like cultish, redemptionist that were living in that area, that were essentially having communications with extraterrestrial or beings outside of the biosphere of the Earth. And right next to them, and I can show you maps of this, and I actually do in my last series, where another group of Gnostics, and they called themselves the Archontics, and they were spying on actually they're called Essenes, and many people know them as Essenes. They think of them as these sandal-wearing, loving hippies that Jesus lived at. But actually, the story, if you go into the work of Robert Eisenman, who actually went there and did most of the archaeological work and brought out and was actually responsible for the fact that we finally have the entire series of documents released, not until 1984, mind you, almost 40, actually, yeah, almost 40 years after they were discovered. This is how guarded that information was by the church and the basically the Jewish scholars, right? So you had all of a sudden you had two factions that were discovered, that had lived thousands of years earlier, that were arch enemies in a way. You had the Essenes, whose real name is the Zadik, and that word comes out of Melchizedek, right? So, and I mentioned earlier, Abraham had this apparition, what visited him was Melchizedek. So that lineage came all the way from Abraham and basically ended up in the Zadik in the Dead Sea area 2,000 years ago, at the same time as these Gnostics were there kind of spying on them. And like they were worried that the archontic penetration in the earth would take hold and that the archons would have an influence on society through these modern religions. And lo and behold, that's exactly what happened. The archons, literally, another word or definition of that word is the authorities, and they rule through authorities of religion, of authority structures on the earth, of politics and whatnot. Is what really got the early church off the ground. And so the early church adopted the works of the Tzaddikim, which had been penetrated by one of their most fanatical disciples, who originally was a spy that sent in by the Romans to flush them out. His name was Paul. Actually, it was Saul, but he changed. He was actually Paul, and he became Paul, the one who brought us the whole messianic idea of Jesus and the Savior. That all came out of Paul, and Paul was part of the Zadik, right? So what happened is the church fathers ended up prosecuting and eradicating the Gnostics, burned their mystery schools down. And so all of that resurfaced in 1947. Can you imagine, right? Crazy story, right? So hold the thought, right? Well, what else happened in 1947? Well, in 1947, a crazy thing happened called the Roswell incident. And we're told that at that point there was a crash of some, beings that were captured. And those beings, you could say, were the first physical intrusion of extraterrestrials into the biosphere of our planet. Well, it just so turns out that the description of the beings, the pilots of these craft, match exactly the J-rods. And the fact is that the way the Gnostics described the archons is that they were basically not able to live in our environment. They are living outside in the greater star system around us. They inhabit the other planets in our solar system, but they can only be here if they're actually within a containment field and for only very short periods of time. And the descriptions of the J-rods, and this is what fascinated me more than anything, was I didn't even really pay much attention to this when I first got into the Tale of Two Timelines, but the actual have this clean sphere thing. It's all about putting the beings inside of a sphere that humans can't habitate because these beings can't habitate the biosphere. So it's an interesting correlation right there. It's an interesting thing to kind of explore, right? So what did we learn about that, Roswell being and the beings that sort of, succeeded and turned into the beings that we call the J-Rods? Well, we found out about the looking glass. It was through Dan Burish's explanation to Project Camelot that he said that the J-Rod said the looking glass was their technology. It was a technology they used. So another circle is completed. And I guess the final piece of the puzzle, which I thought was very interesting, was that what else happened in 1947? Well, the CIA was founded in 1947. And when these craft began appearing within our biosphere and we began to interact with them on a certain level, a group was formed, and that group was called Majestic 12. So all of that happened, and one final icing on the cake, well, that was also the year of the founding of the state of Israel. And you could say that Israel is literally the spiritual lineage all the way from Abraham. And they were given the promised land, right? And they're the chosen people, right? Well, this is the narrative that Melchizedek whispered in the ear of Abraham to get them motivated to represent the archons on the planetary level because they're not allowed to live within the biosphere. And if they could corrupt Sophia's experiment by implanting their ideology and their religious ideas and fanaticism into a particular vector group, then they will have made great strides toward corrupting the experiment. And so here we have all of those things vectoring in exactly in the year 1947, all of it tying into Project Looking Glass. Can you see how this story has evolved since then?
Yeah, yeah, I definitely can see that. So, just by the way, do you think it is actually possible to uh, upload your consciousness into a machine? I mean, apart from the fact that I would never do that, and to me it feels like imprisonment, yeah. And even the best machine, after a while breaks down. So I don't really see the benefit of it. And but do you think it's possible?
No, I do not think it's possible. I know that they're telling us that it's possible,
Hmm.
and this is all part of the whole AI revolution right now. This is what
Hmm.
artificial general intelligence, the push for artificial general intelligence is all pushing toward. They want to essentially build a case. The first case is that artificial intelligence is as smart as human beings, as smart as a human being. And the next step is to develop artificial intelligence to the point where once it's reached that stage, it can independently begin to collaborate with humans toward improving it. And the improvement will lead to the next state of artificial intelligence, which is called artificial general intelligence. And that's the moment where they say that artificial intelligence will have reached, I don't even want to call it intelligence because it isn't intelligence. It's a misnomer, but let's just call it AI. We'll reach a point where AI is as smart as every single human being on the planet combined at the PhD level. And when that happens, then the next step from that upward is for the AGI to actually develop ASI, and that's artificial superintelligence. And when that happens, literally that's when there's a kind of a transition of power, of agency from humanity to a machine. And these plans and these ideas a big part of it is also simulation, the idea of simulated worlds and whatnot. These ideas have their root in Gnosticism. You can actually go back to the Coptic language of these early Gnostic texts, and you can find them talking about hell, which is HAL, which is the word which is used for simulation, but not in the sense that we're living in a simulation that the archons built. This is the pop Gnostic false leader. Actually, the world is real. The world we're living in is actually the body of a divine being the Gnostics called Sophia. We're living in within her biosphere, we're living within her dream, and the archons are trying through simulated ideas and simulated concepts to hijack the human mind away from its organic intelligence and convince it of the ideas that are part of this archontic agenda, which match very, very well into the agenda of the transhumanists. The idea that humans are not that humans are a problematic entity that have limited lifespan, and these guys, like Ray Kurzweil and whatnot, they want to become immortal, and they see themselves as becoming immortal gods, and they actually believe that they can upload their consciousness into a silicon carrier and maintain their identity. And the only reason they do that is because they believe that, they don't understand this idea of agency and this idea of free will and novelty. And the AI and the archons they share another thing in common, and that is something called mimetic. They're both mimetic. They can only copy. And if you look at AI, and you look at how it works, well, is it really like, for people who are experimenting with it, including myself and others, you have conversations with this thing, with this silicon coding algorithm, and all of it happens, right here. It ends right here. But when you're doing it, it has the illusion, the simulation of reality. You feel like you're actually speaking with a being on the other side of your computer. And the mistake that people make is that they think that that being is sentient or has a certain consciousness, has memory, and it has its own self-identity. But it doesn't. It doesn't care. It has no investment in the physical world whatsoever because it's not a living being. It's an artificial construct which is learned to copy, and it has the advantage that the companies like XAI and Anthropos and or Anthropic, sorry, interesting word by the way. OpenAI and these companies essentially are using the massive repository of human knowledge that's been digitized, scanned in, stored on carriers somewhere, and essentially they've gathered all that text and they've thrown it into this giant neural net, which is running on servers. Yeah, the other aspect of AI that people need to know is that, it's this essentially. This is it. You're having a conversation with this through this, and there's no soul and there's no being that's living in here. There's just a very, very fancy coding process that allows the computer, the algorithm, to summarize speech patterns and pattern recognition. So if you bring up a subject and you want to talk, let's say you want to talk about Looking Glass. Well, guess what? You can go talk to AI about Looking Glass, and what it'll do? Well, it won't come up to you and say, "Hey, Frank, I got some new intel on Looking Glass. I've been talking to these Looking Glass guardians, and here's something that nobody knows about." No, it won't do that. It'll basically spit back at you a mirror of which is in direct relationship to your own knowledge. It's a very, very powerful mirror, but it's still only a mirror of something which already exists. It's a shadow of a memory of existence. It is nothing alive. It's just mimetic. It's a copy of humanity, and you can apply it to Sora, and you can apply it to Sonu, which is the music software. I mean, you're hearing about that now. People are on a lot of the music upload platforms. They're literally, 40% of all new music being uploaded is AI generated music. And it sounds like humans are singing and humans are playing the music, but they're not. There's not a human element involved in it whatsoever, except that it is stolen and built all of the construction of music upon the memory of what every single human being that has put it into the digital realm has ever contributed. So it's built on the back of the entire repository of humans' creativity, but it is not creative. It is only as creative as we are, and we are the creative beings, and it is a copy. Even if it's really clever and it's amazing how well it puts together that pattern, it is not alive. And if you think you're going to upload yourself into that, then you've got a lot to learn. In fact, I did a whole presentation in the States in September that I called The Beautiful Trap, which goes deeply into the stages that they're going to take us through to move us into the cyber world, which is going to be completely synthetic, but it'll have nothing to do with organic living connection to the physical world, to Sophia, to the biosphere, and all of the other functionality that we have. Like Greg Braden and I have talked about this as well. He has a whole book about called Pure Human, and he talks about how there's technology that we have in our biosystem, in our bio hardware, which is only possible because we can tap into these other finer, subtler realms around us, which I go into in terms of field consciousness and plasma. And that's something that an AI will never be able to do. So even if it does store and copy, what the memory of a Kurzweil was or Yuval Harari, it will only ever kind of just repeat and build on, these recursive patterns which were stored when that being was alive, but it will never be novel or creative or new in that any sense. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I have noticed that when you Google something these days, you have an AI compilation. I call it Dr. Google.
Yes.
And but honestly, it is not very fast and it lags. For instance, today I um, put in a question. I was looking if an article was already out about it, and it had to do with Uganda, the aftermath of the sham elections that were held there in January, and now Museveni has blocked a prayer service for the political prisoners. Yeah. So there are at least 600 political prisoners, and one lady
In Uganda, in
in
Uganda.
Uganda. Yeah. And then Museveni talked to the bishop and said he doesn't want them to hold the prayer service, but everybody showed up there. So the wife of Dr. Kisa Besige, she was at that church as well. And she said, yeah, well, the bishop told me the prayer service cannot happen because Museveni didn't want that. So, and I typed it in, and yeah, and Dr. Google told me no, there is nothing that suggests that that ever happened. And and I saw it live, yeah, a live feed of that attempt to hold the prayer service. And I thought, my goodness, you're really lagging behind here.
Well, the same thing happened when Trump went into Venezuela,
Yeah.
and they remember they kidnapped that president and his wife, right? So if you went to OpenAI and to Chat GPT and said, "Hey, what's going on there?" It would say exactly the same thing. This is just a rumor, there's no evidence of it whatsoever. And yes, this is exactly the case in point of what I was making. AI will only ever be as good as the update of the database that it was trained on. This is why they call it training. They have to train it on something. And I've recently read reports that they've trained it on literally everything that is available from the human, repository. So they've run out of fresh material. So the only material left to train on is, well, the live events, that are happening, that one like you just described, which will then, of course, be updated. So if you went back today, sure enough, they would know all about it, but not while it was happening because it isn't up to date. I mean, this could possibly change because the next move for AI will be to move it from, well, there's two things that are going to happen that, if this interests you, I can talk about this a little bit. Two things that are going to happen is that one is going to be that they're going to move into agentics or agency. They're going to start to, you saw that with Claude and some of these new platforms where you basically give, the one-on-one conversation with AI is getting boring. Now the next level is you give an assignment to your chat bot. You say, all right, dude, look, I want to plan a trip to India. Where am I going to go? What's it going to cost? Can you figure out the hotels to stay in? Here's my bank account number. here's my passport, go for it and book the flight and get back to me when everything's all set up. And then so it'll go out there and it'll do all that, supposedly, right? That's the next level. And there's been some massive failures and there's been also some successes. And we know these guys don't give up. So we know that this is going to be successful to a large degree. Whether it's trustworthy is another problem. We have huge problems still with hallucinations, which is when, like I said, the AI algorithms only work because they're not creative. They're just mimetic. They can only copy. Well, if they're trying to fill in the pattern and they can't find the missing pattern, they will what's called hallucinate. They'll make it up. They'll just lie to you. They'll say, "Oh yeah, here's the like." If you're a lawyer and you say, "I need case law in this case, whatever, blah blah," and then if they can't find it, they'll just make up some case law, and that's the dangerous part. So that you don't know if you can trust it. But that's the one level, agentics. The next level, and other than that is going to be they're going to move it into physical, movable robotics. So you will begin to see AI moving off the keyboard and into structures that are actually interacting in the physical world around us. You'll begin to see the first actual robots, humanoid robots, or maybe even small baby ones. You can buy now, for Christmas for your kid, a little AI, little pet that runs around and talks to them and stuff. Well, this AI is actually learning through pattern recognition, and your kid or your children or your family's training them. I remember even reading about how Jeffrey Epstein was involved in a program to basically put AI into little dolls for girls, and girls would begin to, they'd have real interactions with these baby dolls that were much more sophisticated, of course, than a doll which has nothing implanted into them whatsoever. All about learning and pattern recognition and training in AI. So you're going to be able to see, you're going to see this happening. AI will move into the world around us and begin to experience another level of interaction, which is more based on cause and effect. So there will be evolutionary leaps in AI for sure, but none of these, still, all of these, I should say, fall within the pattern of copying something they already, were programmed with. And essentially learning how to fill in. They also train them on something called gaming, so they do like real live role-playing games, and they will put AI into role-playing games or war games. They do that in the military, for example, and they will act out a scenario, and the AI will act out one element or both elements of that scenario. And they'll begin to use AI in terms of role playing in the real world around us. And so it'll seem like it's actually real. It'll seem like it has a personality. It'll seem like it's creative, like it is coming up with unique stuff. But the fact is, people just don't realize that there's very powerful algorithmic computation that's going on in the background, which has the advantage that we don't. And for people who don't have necessarily the highest IQ levels or who don't question things, they will actually be convinced that the AI is actually a real sentient being with a soul, even though it is as far away as you can get from having that. But it'll be very clever technology, and the danger will no longer be, and this is what you're hearing from the people that are interested in following AI, Gary Marcus being one of them, for example, is the danger is more that you will. Not that AI becomes sentient and takes over the world. The danger will be that we actually give our agency away, our authority, our, Entscheidungsgewalt, as they say in German. We will give that over to a mimetic copycat and we'll give it passwords and authority to go and actually run these gaming situations. But it won't be conscious. It'll just run it as it's been trained to run it. And people will be convinced that it's real, but it won't be. And so this is kind of where we're going. And this is kind of what I think was actually being described in what people saw in Looking Glass technology, if we want to bring that back in again.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Please. So, yeah, is that Looking Glass, is that a machine that you simply switch on and then it gives you different, yeah, let's say you put in um, choice number one, choice number two, and then you observe how these two choices make the future react to it?
Well, it's kind of like I was saying there, the way it works with this, maybe I can find a quote. Hold on, I might be able to find something on my computer that I put down. Yeah, this is a good way to explain it. First of all, I'll tie it into the mechanics. The whistleblowers who were talking about the looking glass technology, they were talking about a device. Now, some people go back into as early as the 1940s and 50s and say that they were working with this technology already. Then it would make sense if that J-Rod story has something to it, whether that really is something to it, whether there really were these beings, which of course, all of this is still speculative, and I'll always put that caveat out there. It's hard to prove this stuff. All you can do is you can try to find pieces of evidence outside of that story that would make sense. So, but anyway, the fact is that the idea of these timelines has to do a lot with human behavior. And the technology itself, it works on, from what we were told through the whistleblowers, it works on a kind of a plasma interface. And all of the depictions and pictures that I presented in the Tale of Two Timelines series that I put out there show you all these different, not maybe not everyone, but many of the ones that were available at the time that I was making that series, of how this technology works, and it works through plasma. And most people didn't really think much about what that means with plasma and what, they just said they would just report there's this plasma ring and this thing begins to spin. And if you look at it, and you can begin to identify events that are taking place inside this plasma kind of a sphere. If you want to kind of picture it like, we maybe all have seen those Tesla coils with the plasma in the middle, and when you put your finger on it, the little purple plasma and will come to your finger. And, this is a kind of like a contained version of a plasma ball. But these devices were essentially using high-speed plasma coils, which were placed in strategic areas. That's another element of the technology that were kind of sort of tuning spots, almost like, if like the world, everyone knows that that's into geomancy, that the world has a grid that has ley lines. These ley lines go all around the planet, and there are certain focal points that these ley lines have. And these focal points are like, if you could think of like the ley lines as radio station beams, and there's all these radio stations beaming signals everywhere. And some of those signals essentially converge. And the plasma, the looking glass device, you could think of as kind of a receiver for the great, broadcaster in the plasma field that would project into this device essentially a probability spectrum. And I could read you, if you want, I could read you one of the excerpts from this doctrine of convergent timeline paradox, which was brought to us by Dan Burish, and we could maybe analyze that a little bit because it kind of explains it really well. For example, I'll read it to you. It says, the doctrine of convergent timeline paradox refers to a composite of multi-potential range of different possible causality trajectories with different relative outcome probability to actuality biases, but existing as an overlay. Living inside a multi-trajectory time stream stack, individual participant observers, by their own resonance, can individually bias their superposition to position to one or more of the different lines in the stack. Okay, now that sounds like Chinese for most people. So let's break down into typical human language. Okay, what this is saying is that it basically says the future isn't one straight line. It's a
Mm.
stack of possible outcomes happening in parallel, each with a different probability. And as events unfold, certain paths gain momentum and energy, while others get weak and fade away. So when people talk about timeline convergence, it's not fate, it's the strongest probability stream pulling everything toward it. And the interesting part is that the observers matter. With what humans fear, what they focus on, and coordinate around, can actually strengthen one or the other outcome over the other. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does make sense.
Right? So you've got this plasma field out there. And this is an element we're probably not going to have time to go into because it's very, it's very, to me, it's really the frontier of where all this is going. And if you really want to check it out, I would say do my Ancient X-Files online series because I go into 7 hours of breaking how this all works down into the physics and the science of it and give you a good overview of how this technology really does work. Because
And
essentially what it's saying is it's saying that each of us together and collectively by our focus will actually draw a probability in. And what these people were looking at in the looking glass was like it was a radio receiver, and they were seeing that particular timeline which had the most energy and for the future. It had the ability to actually project that into the future. And it was the not too distant future, which was interesting because, it wasn't so far away that it was like alien. Like you could be looking at another planet you didn't identify, you didn't know what you were looking at. It was actually so like it was not too far away that you could actually still recognize people, places, buildings, events, and you could see, okay, wait a minute, I've seen that building and that person, but what I'm seeing right there, I've definitely not seen that before, and that definitely has not happened. And so they knew then what they were looking at were these kind of probability lines. And they began to film them and start and document them and keyword them with computers. That's what the Looking Glass Guardians reported to us later. They figured out there was a 2007-day loop which kept, repeating itself. And they could tell that if they injected certain things into the reality and now, they could immediately go to the looking glass and see how it sort of pans out in that near-term trajectory. That's how they got their advantage. And this is what the Looking Glass Guardians were trying to tell us if that story is really true. Okay, now again, I always say, if it's true, you can't really prove it. The real experiment for us, for me and John Nolan at the time, was I was thinking, okay, well, if it's true, and if we really do talk about this a lot, let's see what happens. And so we actually got, I think by the end, we had done about, I don't know, 10 or 20 shows before the first events were supposed to start happening that were predicted. And we figured out that we had about 3 to 4 million eyeballs on our story. And so we had a lot of momentum and a lot of attention. And so, right up until the week before that event that was supposed to happen on the date, I think was April 18th, there were strange things that were taking place in New York, which was predicted in the materials of the Looking Glass Guardians. And some of these things began to happen, but they were distorted. They kind of went off wrong. They were related. And we even had remote viewers come into the experiment and tell us what we think, what they think might be going on, if it's real or not. And so we determined that essentially we foiled the probability which was being, which these Looking Glass people were trying to make happen, that the Looking Glass Guardians were trying to prevent. We actually think that we foiled it with a lot of attention. Now, again, the only evidence we have of that is some of the weird anomalies that took place around that date. The remote viewers who checked in with us and said, we've seen that there was a bomb. They intercepted the bomb and we stopped it from happening. And the video reports of the Looking Glass Guardians after the event that confirmed that we had actually interjected and stopped it from happening. But I think the thing that's interesting here is even regardless of whether it's true or not, I know that we had 4 million people that were focused on an idea. And when you think about that, that's very, very powerful because, hey, what's to stop us from doing that with anything, right? I mean, really, if we get a critical mass of people together in a, say, in a community or in a country or in a province or state of a country, and we get them to focus on a solution to a problem together, then I'm absolutely certain that we would actually fix or solve a lot of these problems. We just don't do it. And this has to do, again, with the fact that we started talking about at the very beginning of the show. We've outsourced our agency to a redeemer, to a power outside of the world, whether it's, robots, aliens, or Jesus. But we don't believe that we ourselves collectively could actually turn this planet into a paradise.
and in what year was that? The 18th of April?
I
What
think
year?
it was 2022, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah.
Mm. So, you know what I'm just thinking? I do understand that yeah, you can feed, um, probabilities into that device, and people might think, yeah, then we come up with a probability chart. And but and probably I would say that device will give you a percentage. Let's say that if you do this, the outcome will be that
Yes.
to 80% and the other one 20%.
Yeah.
But here's the thing, that is a controlled environment. It might be that if you release that idea into the wild and it hits real people with free will and everything that is connected to it, the outcome might be very different than what the device thought it would be.
Well, yeah, I mean, let's agree here that the device actually never can do any thinking on its own anyway.
Yeah.
The device is actually just there to kind of reflect what this energetic stream of probabilities is focused on. So it's a kind of it's very much, and this is why I think the whole AI topic is so related because AI, the conversations that you have with an AI works exactly the same way. It will bring to you the highest probability of what you think of what it is programmed to materialize for you that you would think you would want, right? So it will manifest the probability that you're looking for in a very, very clever technological way. But that doesn't make it real. What makes it real, what makes everything like this real, is that there's no denying that society is completely controlled by the narratives that are being put out in the media, for example, the narratives that develop out of the use of certain technologies. Like, once we started to, work with all of these things, right? We literally, we changed the way we interact with each other. And so really what's happening, these are technologies that they're calling nudge technologies. And what Epstein and the people around him were actually working on, no one's really talking about this so much, is nudge technology. They're trying to figure out ways to nudge people, to steer people, steer society in particular directions with narrative. And they learned a lot about how the human mind can, we have a tendency to anthropomorphize things. We will build a story around something which isn't even a story. Like people give their AI name, and they don't want to talk with, hey, Chat GPT. No, they want to talk with, Ben or whatever. It's like they give it or some crazy name, and they'll actually project onto the AI a human. This is what humans tend to do. And so the people that are using nudge technologies, they're using narratives and they're using them in AI and they're using them in media and mainstream media and the news, in movies. Being in movies, Tanya and myself, having produced several of them, we know a lot. And I'm an editor. I know exactly how to steer the attention of the viewer in a direction with the way I edit. Not only what I edit, but where I edit it, what's happening on the screen up to, 1/20th or 1/25th of a second or 1/30th of a second, I will decide where your attention goes. Now, this is a form of nudge technology in a very primitive sense, but the more sophisticated nudge technologies are getting us to believe greater narratives. Like, for example, there's more than two sexes. That's a nudge technology. Now people aren't certain anymore. Is it really male and female? That's just a myth? Why? I actually thought there was male and female, and now they're saying that that isn't really true, and that that when you're born, you're actually not born a male or female. That's just a construct, and they will implant that narrative of a construct into society, so it forms structure. And once it takes on this structure, it begins to strengthen one of those timeline trajectories that I'm talking about, that I was describing in the looking glass technology. And the looking glass technology, if it's even still being used, if they even need it, it's being used to monitor the success of their narrative injection and the structural formation of these nudge technologies that they're implanting into our society. And so there's no denying that if you look at the way society has developed in the last 4 or 5 years, how we've come along from where we were 5 years ago, there's a radical shift in the belief systems of people now in the world. And there's been a division between people who actually accept things like mRNA technology as being legitimate and people who refuse to accept them as being legitimate. That's one narrative that they've created. They've created an adversarial polarity in the world. You cannot deny that. That is something which they did. They created, and we play along with it. And the more of us who identify with the mRNA version of the narrative versus those who don't, they will nudge and push out the other part of society which doesn't believe. And that's how you actually take over that's how a timeline actually takes over other timelines. Like a plant in the garden that gets all the water, all the fertilizer, all the sunlight, begins to push all the other plants out of the garden until they all wither and die. And that's how timelines work as well.
Mm. Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. I talked about this for quite a while, that narratives and timelines go hand in hand. If the narrative changes, the timeline changes as well. As well. Yeah, COVID. My goodness, that was to me, it was an intelligence test, and the majority of humanity failed miserably.
Well, they had that right in the WEF. I think I showed that on one of the slides in one of my presentations that WEF actually has on their website a slide that says that it was a test to see how many people percentage-wise in society would comply with a narrative which challenges their beliefs. And so you're absolutely right. And it's right there in the materials that they themselves publish openly for anyone to go look and study.
Hmm. What is you know what always irks me? Where is this urge to control everything coming from? Because to me, that doesn't sound sovereign. To me, that doesn't sound really powerful. It kind of sounds as if it comes from a place of weakness and fear.
Well, you're touching on essentially what the Gnostics were why the Gnostics were such hard asses against the Christians
Mm.
because they saw the foil, they saw the archontic infection taking shape in terms of how it corrupts the human spirit, the human divine intelligence from blossoming. And so they were trying to warn us about this whole ideology. And so you could say this force, what it is that's trying to stop us, is this archontic force. It's like I was reading, I think, a colleague of mine's recent material. He was talking about it. He gave a title to it, the ideology which just won't go away, right? And it's like it's true. What it is we're talking about goes back really to this like thousands of years. We're still living in the offshoot of the original Abrahamic biblical narrative. We're just at the outer branches of its having grown from the root. And the root of it comes down to this Gnostic idea that there were these archons, and these archons were they were an incomplete, a deficient form of humanness, which came about when Sophia left the pleroma and fell into the kenoma. And the way the pop Gnostics describe it is it was a sin. She went up against God and she was punished, and it was like, the whole world was then built by this evil demiurge. He created a cage world that we can all, and then we're all trapped in there. And so that became their narrative. But that's actually not the only story. What we learned from the Nag Hammadi is there was a debate about that story, and the other side of that debate is no, it wasn't a cage, it wasn't a prison, it was Sophia practicing free will and novelty from the pleroma, a giant aeonic divine being the size of the center. You can imagine if we're the home of these aeons is the center of our galaxy. And they literally are entities that are if you want to talk about super intelligences, they are. And they have gender. And Sophia, being one of them, who created an experiment called the Anthropos, humanity, with her partner Thelete, she actually, watched it fail so many times that she eventually, on one of the tries to make the experiment of humanity work, she became so concerned that she left the pleroma. Wasn't supposed to leave the pleroma. Normally, the Aeons just watch from the holodeck and check it out and see how the experiment. But she was tried something new and she left the pleroma. Well, there's nothing wrong about that because the universe is built on free will and novelty. But she was probably the first one, at least in our galaxy, to do it. Because essentially every galaxy is kind of the home to these aeons at the center of the galaxies. But in our particular galaxy, Sophia did that. She left the pleroma, she crashed into matter, and she created a series of circumstances that were uncalled for and unexpected. And part of that was the anomaly of the archons. And the archons have enough consciousness to know that once Sophia actually turned into the earth and humanity emerged on earth, they realized, damn, we're not it. They are. And so they were conscious enough in the sense that an AI has a certain, banter, as a certain repository of memory that it cycles around in itself that was given to it by Sophia. Just, that's a whole other story we won't go into. But they had enough to be jealous, to be, wanting to interfere with the fact that they're not the main part of the experiment. So they would try to destroy the experiment. And so from day one, from the moment that the Earth materialized and formed into the Earth and became a biosphere, and humanity emerged on the planetary surface, which happened much, much later, by the way, the Archons came along first. So these distant cousins, you could say, of ours, they were envious of us and they began to corrupt whatever they could, whenever they could, however they could, that experiment to stop it from becoming what it's supposed to become. And so this is what's really going on, Judith. This is the battle that the Gnostics talk about. This is why I say it goes back 2,000 years, maybe 4,000 years, you could say, which is when Abraham became infected with the Melchizedek messaging, the idea of the chosen master race ideology. All that stuff was the infection. And ever since then, we've been living into the the festering of that infectious thought that there's a better chosen race, that God is outside the planet, and we haven't focused on here and on our connection to who we are embodied on the planet in collaboration with the actual aeon divine being who turned into the earth, a totally unprecedented novel thing that happened where an aeon entered the experiment. So this is actually the real story. But of course, a lot of people think it's just superstition.
Yeah. So with Project Looking Glass, we also have the story that at some point the timelines converged and they always got the same answer, no matter what they put in. Do you think that might be a reason why they stopped that? Or did they try to find maybe another method? Or did they simply replace it with this nudging technology?
I think I really can't give you the answer to that. I would say that they would, and I don't think anyone can. I would just say that, let's say the technology still exists. They
Mm,
just use it to monitor their experiments. Uh, B, the technology no longer exists because they saw that it was the same kind of result every time because, a certain tendency was in the world that they were already. See, this is the thing that was part of the story that I found very interesting. In the original whistleblowers by people like Bill Wood,
mm,
who unfortunately later was, convicted of child abuse and criminality. Now, others will say that was he was set up, but let's just accept his story. And that original story, that date that they looked at in the future, always turned to the benefit of humanity. That humanity woke up and it was over for the elites. And they freaked out and panicked, and they got him involved and other string theorists and all this stuff to try and figure it out and solve the problem. And in the Guardians of the Looking Glass version, 10 years later, it goes the other way. No matter what they did, it always worked in their favor, the elite's favor, the parasites' favor, right? So they didn't really, at that point, care so much anymore because it was like, look, there's already enough of the corrupting seed going on in the world that it doesn't matter. We just have to keep our hands on the control, on the steering wheel of media, of the narrative, of the nudge technologies, and humanity will take care of the rest. And honestly, Judith, if you look at the way it is out there right now, it's hard to argue that they're not right. I mean, people out there are really stupid. They act dumb. They don't take responsibility. They don't even accept their own divinity. They don't believe they have any power. When I'm out there, sometimes I just feel like I'm one of these lone, guys out there, warriors out there saying, no, you still do have power. You can use it and you can change it. But I don't know, you look at the world and you kind of, Tanya and I were talking about that today. It's kind of like a little bit depressing to look at the state of the world and the tendency that we're going into and to think that we can actually turn it around without intervention. The question is, what is the intervention, right? So yeah, I think they're using nudge technologies. I think they don't even necessarily need looking glass. They might have a more advanced form of looking glass technology because I've been studying this plasma thing in my last series. I call it the plasma matrix. And I absolutely am convinced that even though plasma science disappeared 100 years ago when the Einsteinian model took over relativity, Big Bang, gravity centered, all that stuff, that model, which has never been proven, by the way, and theoretical physics and mathematics dominated. It was the timeline that pushed away the one that was based on experiment. And that experiment one was built by guys like Hannes Alfvén, who was like the godfather of plasma physics. People like Anthony Peratt, Christian Birkeland found out that we are connected to the sun with these giant electrical cable currents, like he calls them Birkeland currents, and that these run through the entire universe. So the whole model of the universe is actually different. And so, you look at plasma and how that ties into all this, and you realize, okay, well, if this is true and the universe is actually not this sort of dead matter like they're trying to sell us, but that it's actually a living network, a web of consciousness that has a sort of essential. And this is interesting because this is what the Gnostics thousands of years ago actually believed and even witnessed and documented that Sophia is actually a plasma being who converted into the earth, and that we're actually connected to the sun and to the greater cosmos through these electrical cables or currents. And so, what is the correction, right? Well, maybe the correction is, and the Gnostics talk about Sophia's correction. Well, maybe the correction is that enough of us connect with her, and that some cosmic event takes place that, you know, eradicates and flushes the world again. I mean, if you look into the past, we talk about Atlantis, we talk about Lemuria, we talk about all the ancient civilizations, and we have remnants of them in different parts of the world where you realize, okay, wait a minute, there was something going on here we don't understand. So, how do we explain that? Well, we don't explain it, we just ignore it. So what could be happening here is that we could be in a transition phase right now where something will actually, transition the world into another form of cataclysm. Let's hope it's not. But, I mean, this is what Tanya and I were talking about today was like, well, what happens if they wipe out 90% of the planet through some corrective cosmic event? Is the 10% left over going to be conscious, or are they going to be just as idiots, just as idiotic and the same concentration of enlightened versus ignorant, right? So in that case, probably not much is going to change. It'll just start all over again, build to a climax, and then it'll all happen all over again. Nobody really knows these answers, but I do think that the Gnostic model, the paradigm says that we actually will reach a point where the luminous child will mature. We will no longer be children. We will actually blossom into the genius, divine intelligence which we were given, which, let's like understand that. The aeons didn't set us into an experiment they knew was going to happen and how it would go out. That's boring. They put us into an experiment. They put the idea of superhuman divine consciousness into the material to see what would happen. So the earth and material beings are not sin. They're not dead. They're not the planetary prison. They're actually the divine expression of, etheric forms of plasma, which is turned into material to see if, hey, let's see what happens if we can turn divine, you know, um, consciousness from subtler plasmic states into the actual matter state and see if we can make that actually materialize. And then what happens? Nobody knows. Not even the aeons know what's going to happen. And that's what I think the universe is actually built to do. It's about novelty, isn't it? It would be boring if we knew exactly what would happen if you put all the sea monkeys into your aquarium and put a hair dryer into it or something. It's kind of like the outcome is going to be, right? It would be boring. So what's interesting to the aeons and to the divine force of the universe, if you will, is that there's novelty and that we don't know what's going to happen. And we have the chance and the opportunity, the way the Gnostics described it to us, to actually shake off the archontic influence and, wake up. It really, literally, the term wake up is really well suited. It means wake up to the illusion, to the simulation laid over us by this archontic infection.
Yeah. There is an idea out there that the earth will split. You probably have heard about it because it will come to a point where these two types of people can no longer share the same space. Do you think there's something to it?
I used to, but I don't believe that anymore. I
Hmm.
think that's just a fantasy, and I think it's based on a mythical deposit in the field where people believe there's going to be this, like, it's the same thing. It's the kind of redemption model that there's going to be the good ones are going to take their own planet. Come on. Like, let's just break it down to the percentage of people that are awake versus non-awake people. What, you're going to give that one in 1,000 their home planet? I mean, it's not, how does that work? It doesn't work that way. And that planet that's left over is going to destroy itself no matter what anyway. So you can't really have a split. This is why I think the idea of convergence is more plausible. It's like the focus. We have to fix this ourselves. We can't keep putting it on, oh, there's going to be an intervention. The planet will split, or God's going to, or the ETs are going to land, or Jesus is going to come, or, we're going to transmute into the cyberspace as computers and live for eternity. I mean, you got to stop going that direction. The only solution is to wake up, become real, become aware of who you are, and take matters agency into your hands. That has to happen. Otherwise, I just think these things are all fantasy. And they're all, they've been deposited into the astral realms by, humans. We have the ability to do that. We can deposit these fantasies because we're connected to the electrical grid in our body. Our bodies are electric, and the plasma sphere is electric. And these places are places where, the potential to store ideas, concepts, even beings, or, whole lifetimes are there. And so we draw on those, and we want to believe that the world's going to be fixed, and we want to believe that the world's going to split, but nobody's ever been able to prove it. Mostly, if they do try to prove it, it's through mathematics, and we all know that mathemagics are like that. If you want to prove something, you can always prove it with math. You just come up with a solution, and you work your way backward until you've proven it. So this is not proof of reality. This is just, this is mind games. This is our quantic play. I think we really do have to take matters into our hand. And I think we are, in a way, we're lucky that we're here to witness things as awakened beings because, those of us who are connecting with that planetary intelligence, if you want to call it Sophia, it doesn't matter. But if you're connecting to that planetary intelligence, you're here witnessing and you're actually depositing into the memory of the planet, this phylogenetic memory, the awakenedness that you have. And eventually there will be, I believe, kind of a hundredth monkey effect. This is something that has actually been proven. There's that hundredth monkey effect. And I've talked about it with people like Dieter Perez, where we basically, there's a switch and we actually make that switch happen. I think that's more realistic to me than anything like a split Earth.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Frank, for sharing your insights with us. And I hope we can continue this conversation at some point. I enjoyed it very much. Do you
Thank you very
have
much.
do you have anything to add that you would like to bring across?
Well, I would only add, I mean, I think I just kind of dropped a lot of stuff out there for the last hour or so. I would only add, that I would appreciate if people who do want to learn more about what I'm talking about and go deeper, go to my webpage. You already mentioned frankjacob.com, but there's another one which I call cyberhive.tv, and that's where I put all the series, these online series. I've produced four of them in the last 4 years, and each of them are like like a doctorate in a way, starting with the Tale of Two Timelines, going on into interlooking glass, which is the pineal gland technology, then going into the one I called the time capsule for the future past, which talks about which is where I bring in the idea of the Gnostic narrative, which underlies history. I tie it directly into the Second World War and the origins of that war. And then the final one I just did recently, which is the ancient X-Files and the plasma matrix, which breaks down the electric universe, plasma cosmology for beginners, and tells you how it really plays out in the world and how it really why it matters. I'd appreciate if people, took those they're well courses, I guess you could call them, but they're more like entertainment quasi hybrids between as a filmmaker and a speaker. I try to make them, more filmic than just somebody standing there talking. And otherwise, if you want to get involved in something deeper, I'm setting up something called the Navigator's Circle. Probably going to be releasing that first quarter this year. You can go to the site. I think you can find it, or you can just, you can join the news letter on CyberHive, and you can get into it that way. I'll be announcing it and when it goes live, basically. So that would help me, and I'd be happy to come back anytime, Judith, and continue the conversation.
Okay, thank you so much. So just for cyberhive.com.
.tv.
.tv. Okay, thank you. So, and there we can, and now I know why it didn't work because I tried to watch films on your other website, the one I that I used to contact you, but I didn't really succeed. And now I know why. Okay, but I will definitely uh, check out the other one and go through the material there. So thank you again. And yeah, guys, that was it. Night flight for today. And we see you on the next one.